The scream that tore through the night at the Fort Smith, Arkansas boarding house in the spring of 1876 brought half the residents stumbling into the hallway, oil lamps raised high against the darkness that seemed to press in from every corner. Tessa Owens sat bolt upright in her narrow bed, her nightgown soaked through with perspiration, her chest heaving as if she had run miles instead of simply waking from another nightmare that felt more like drowning in an ocean of shadows. The landlady, Mrs. Patterson, pushed open the door without knocking, her face creased with concern and something else, something that looked uncomfortably like impatience. "Miss Owens, this is the third night this week," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice strained despite the obvious effort to sound sympathetic. "The other tenants are complaining. They have work in the morning and they cannot be woken at all hours by your disturbances." Tessa wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the cold despite the mild temperature of the April night. The darkness in the room felt alive, breathing, watching, and she could not shake the sensation that something terrible lurked just beyond the reach of Mrs. Patterson's lamp. "I apologize," she whispered, her voice still rough from screaming. "I did not mean to wake anyone. It is just that I cannot seem to sleep when it is dark. The dreams come, and they feel so real, as if I am back there again." Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly, though the tension did not leave her shoulders. "I understand you have been through something terrible, dear. Truly, I do. But you cannot continue like this. Perhaps you might see about lighting a candle before you sleep, though I must warn you about the fire risk." After Mrs. Patterson left and the other residents returned to their rooms with muttered complaints, Tessa sat alone in the darkness for what felt like hours, too afraid to close her eyes again. The nightmares had started 6 months ago, after the fire that had consumed her family's farmhouse outside of Little Rock. She had been visiting her aunt in town that night, and by the time she returned the next morning, there was nothing left but charred timber and ash, her parents, her younger brother, all gone in a single night. The marshal had ruled it an accident, a lantern knocked over in the dark. But Tessa knew the truth that haunted her dreams. Her father had been struggling to pay his debts to a local land speculator, and 2 days before the fire, he had received a final warning. She had come to Fort Smith 3 months ago, hoping that distance might ease the nightmares, that a fresh start in a bustling frontier town might give her some peace. Instead, the dreams had grown worse, more vivid, until she could barely distinguish sleeping from waking in those terrible hours when darkness pressed against the windows. She had found work as a seamstress in a shop on Garrison Avenue, and the days were manageable, filled with the familiar rhythm of needle and thread. But the nights were becoming unbearable, and she knew that if she screamed again, Mrs. Patterson would ask her to find other lodgings. The next evening, after finishing her work at the dress shop, Tessa stopped at the general store and purchased a box of candles with money she could barely afford to spend. The proprietor, a kindly older man named Mr. Henderson, wrapped them carefully in brown paper and gave her an extra candle for free when he noticed how her hands trembled as she counted out the coins. "You take care now, Miss Owens," he said gently. "Whatever is troubling you, I hope these bring you some comfort." That night, Tessa lit one of the candles and placed it on the small table beside her bed. The warm glow pushed back the shadows, turning them from threatening depths into mere corners and alcoves. She lay down with her eyes fixed on the flame, watching it dance and flicker, and for the first time in months, she felt her muscles begin to relax. Sleep came slowly, cautiously, and though the dreams still lurked at the edges of her consciousness, they did not overwhelm her. She woke twice during the night to find the candle had burned down considerably, and each time she quickly lit a fresh one before the darkness could fully return. The pattern continued for a week, and Tessa found herself feeling almost human again. Her work at the dress shop improved as exhaustion no longer made her fingers clumsy, and she even managed to smile at the customers who came in for fittings. But candles were expensive, and she was burning through them at an alarming rate. By the end of the second week, she realized she would have to make a choice between eating properly and sleeping with light. And the decision was not as simple as it should have been. It was Mrs. Patterson, who mentioned the ranch when Tessa came down to breakfast one morning looking gaunt and hollow-eyed despite the candles. "There is a cattle operation about 5 miles west of town. The Double M Ranch," the landlady said as she poured weak coffee into chipped cups. "I heard in town yesterday that they are looking for someone to help with cooking and mending for the ranch hands. The pay would be better than what you are making at the dress shop. And it includes room and board. Of course, it would mean living out there with all those rough men, but Mr. Morgan, who owns the place, is supposed to be respectable enough." Tessa considered the offer throughout the day as she hemmed a wedding dress for the daughter of one of Fort Smith's more prosperous merchants. The idea of leaving town, of being even further from the remnants of her old life, felt both frightening and liberating. But the promise of better pay, of not having to choose between food and candles, was compelling. That evening, she asked around about the Double M Ranch and learned that Owen Morgan had built it up from nothing over the past 8 years, that he was known as a fair employer, if a demanding one, and that his operation was one of the most successful in the region. 2 days later, Tessa borrowed a horse from the livery stable, promising to return it by evening, and rode out to the Double M Ranch. The landscape opened up as she left Fort Smith behind rolling hills covered in spring grass stretching toward distant tree lines. The ranch itself was more substantial than she had expected, with a sprawling main house, a large bunkhouse, several barns, and an extensive network of corrals and fencing. Cattle dotted the landscape in every direction, and she could see several men working with horses in one of the larger corrals. She was directed to the main house by a young ranch hand who barely looked old enough to shave, and she found herself standing on a wide porch knocking on a solid oak door that looked like it could withstand a siege. The man who opened it was not what she had been expecting. Owen Morgan stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscular build of someone who spent long hours in physical labor. His dark hair was slightly too long, curling at the collar of his shirt, and his eyes were an unusual shade of gray-green that seemed to shift in the afternoon light. He looked to be in his late 20s, perhaps 30 at most, and there was something about the set of his jaw that suggested both determination and a deep-seated weariness. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that reminded Tessa of distant thunder. She straightened her shoulders and met his gaze directly, refusing to be intimidated. "My name is Tessa Owens. I heard in town that you might be looking for someone to help with cooking and mending for your ranch hands. I am a skilled seamstress, and I can cook well enough, though I will admit my experience is more with family meals than feeding a crew." Owen studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You are from the boarding house in town, are you not? Mrs. Patterson mentioned you might be coming out. Come in, Miss Owens. We can discuss the details." The interior of the house was surprisingly comfortable, furnished with solid, well-made pieces that suggested a man who valued quality over ostentation. Owen led her to a sitting room and gestured for her to take a seat before settling into a chair across from her. "I will be honest with you, Miss Owens. The work is hard and the hours are long. I have 12 men working for me right now, and they need 3 meals a day plus whatever they can take with them when they are working distant sections of the ranch. The mending is constant because ranch work is hard on clothes. In return, I can offer you $40 a month, room and board, and Sundays mostly free unless there is an emergency. You would have your own room in this house, not in the bunkhouse with the men." $40 a month was nearly twice what she was making at the dress shop, and the room and board meant she could actually save money. But there was something she needed to address first, something that might make the entire offer impossible. Tessa twisted her hands in her lap, gathering her courage. "Mr. Morgan, I appreciate the offer, and I would very much like to accept. But I have a condition that might seem strange, and I will understand if it makes you reconsider." Owen raised an eyebrow, waiting. "I have nightmares," Tessa said quietly, the words catching in her throat. "Terrible ones about a fire that killed my family. I cannot sleep in the dark. I need to have a candle burning through the night, every night, or I wake screaming. At the boarding house, I have been disturbing the other tenants, and I worried that I would do the same here with your ranch hands." She expected dismissal, perhaps even derision, but Owen's expression shifted to something that looked almost like understanding. He was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, His voice was gentler than before. "My brother died in a fire when I was 16, he said. "He was only 14, and it was my fault. I had left a lantern burning in the barn while I went to help my father with something, and by the time we realized what had happened, the whole structure was ablaze. Daniel had gone in looking for a newborn calf, and he never came out." The pain in his voice was raw despite the years that must have passed, and Tessa felt something in her chest tighten with shared grief. "I am so sorry," she whispered. Owen cleared his throat and straightened in his chair, his businesslike demeanor returning, though his eyes remained shadowed. "I tell you this so you understand that I do not take fire lightly, but I also understand the nightmares. If you need a candle burning through the night, we can manage that. Your room would be at the far end of the house, away from where I sleep, and the walls are thick enough that you would not disturb anyone. But I would ask that you keep the candle in a proper holder, away from curtains or anything else that might catch, and that you keep a basin of water nearby. Can you agree to those terms?" Relief flooded through Tessa so strongly that she felt dizzy. "Yes, of course. I would never be careless with fire, Mr. Morgan. I have seen what it can do." "Then I believe we have an agreement, Miss Owens. When can you start?" They settled on the following Monday, which gave Tessa time to give notice at the dress shop and pack her few belongings from the boarding house. Mrs. Patterson was clearly relieved to see her go, though she tried to hide it behind well wishes and advice about living among rough ranch hands. The other women at the dress shop were more genuinely sorry to lose her, and they gave her a small package of needles and thread as a farewell gift. When Monday morning arrived, Tessa loaded her single trunk into the wagon that Owen had sent for her and made the journey out to the Double M Ranch feeling both anxious and hopeful. The young ranch hand who had driven the wagon, a cheerful boy who introduced himself as Tommy, kept up a steady stream of conversation that helped ease her nerves. He told her about the other men who worked at the ranch, about the cattle drives they would be preparing for in another month, about how Mr. Morgan was tough but fair and never asked a man to do something he would not do himself. Owen met them when they arrived and helped carry her trunk up to her room. It was larger than her space at the boarding house, with a real bed frame instead of just a mattress on a metal frame, a wardrobe, a writing desk by the window, and a comfortable chair in the corner. The window looked out over the ranch's western pastures, and she could see cattle grazing peacefully in the afternoon sun. "There are candles in the drawer of the bedside table," Owen said, setting her trunk down at the foot of the bed. "And I have asked Tommy to make sure you always have a good supply. If you need anything else, my room is down the hall toward the front of the house." "Thank you," Tessa said, meaning it more deeply than he could probably understand. "I promise I will earn my keep, Mr. Morgan." "I am sure you will. And Miss Owens? When we are here at the house, you can call me Owen. Mr. Morgan makes me feel like I should be wearing a suit and tie." She smiled despite her nervousness. "Then you should call me Tessa." The first few days were an adjustment. Cooking for 12 hungry ranch hands was a different proposition than cooking for a family, and Tessa found herself rising before dawn to get biscuits and bacon and eggs prepared for the men who started work at first light. The ranch hands were initially awkward around her, unused to having a woman in their midst, but they were unfailingly polite and effusively grateful for meals that did not come from a can or consist of beans and hardtack. The mending was indeed constant, as Owen had warned, but it was work Tessa found soothing in its familiarity. Owen himself was often gone during the day, working alongside his men to repair fences, move cattle, or handle the 1,000 other tasks that running a ranch demanded. But he appeared for meals, and Tessa found herself paying more attention to him than she probably should. He was quiet, but when he spoke, it was usually worth hearing. He treated his men with respect, and she noticed how they responded to him not with fear but with genuine loyalty. And sometimes when he thought no one was watching, she caught glimpses of a deep sadness in his eyes that echoed her own. True to her warning, Tessa needed the candles every night. She would light one before she prepared for bed, making sure it was secure in its holder on the table, well away from any fabric or paper. The golden light would push back the shadows, and she would watch the flame until sleep finally claimed her. Some nights were better than others, and on the bad nights she would wake gasping and trembling, but the light was always there, steady and reassuring, and she would quiet herself before any screams could escape. It was after one of the bad nights when she came down to start breakfast looking pale and exhausted that Owen appeared in the kitchen earlier than usual. The sun had not yet risen, and the house was dark except for the lamp she had lit to work by. He moved so quietly that she did not realize he was there until he spoke. "Another nightmare?" Tessa startled, nearly dropping the bowl of flour she was holding. "You frightened me," she said, pressing a hand to her chest where her heart was racing. "I apologize. I did not mean to sneak up on you." Owen moved into the lamplight, and she saw that he was already dressed for the day, his hair damp as if he had just washed. "I heard you walking around late last night, and I wanted to make sure you were all right." "I am fine," Tessa said automatically, then sighed. "No, that is not true. Last night was a difficult one. But the candle helped, as it always does. I am grateful that you allow me to keep it burning." Owen poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot she had just made and leaned against the counter, studying her with those unusual gray-green eyes. "What do you dream about, if you do not mind my asking?" No one had asked her that before. Mrs. Patterson had wanted the nightmares to stop, but had shown no interest in their content. The other women at the dress shop had offered sympathy, but had seemed uncomfortable with details. But there was something about the way Owen asked, something in his tone that suggested he genuinely wanted to know, that made Tessa answer honestly. "I dream that I am in the house when it is burning," she said quietly, her hands automatically continuing to work, mixing flour and baking powder and salt for biscuits. "I can hear my mother calling for me and my brother crying, and I'm trying to reach them, but the flames keep pushing me back. The smoke is so thick I cannot breathe, and the heat is unbearable, and I know that I'm going to die there with them. Sometimes I dream that I do die, that the flames consume me and I wake up feeling like my skin is still burning. Other times I dream that I get out, but they do not, and I have to stand there watching the house collapse with them still inside, and that is somehow worse." Her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper by the end, and she was surprised to find tears on her cheeks. She wiped them away impatiently with the back of her hand, leaving a smudge of flour behind. Owen set down his coffee cup and moved closer, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket. "May I?" he asked. And when she nodded, he gently wiped the flour from her face. His touch was careful, almost tentative, and Tessa found herself acutely aware of how close he was standing. "I dream about Daniel," Owen said after a moment, stepping back to give her space. "In my dreams, I always hear him calling for help, but I cannot find him in the smoke and flames. Or sometimes I find him too late, and I have to watch him die. I have had those dreams for 12 years now, and they have never stopped, though they have become less frequent." "Does anything help?" Tessa asked, "was besides time?" "Keeping busy during the day, making sure I am exhausted enough that when sleep finally comes, it is too deep for dreams." Owen's smile was rueful. "And sometimes on the very worst nights I light a candle and sit up reading until dawn. There is something about the light that makes the darkness seem less oppressive." Tessa looked at him with new understanding, seeing not just her employer, but someone who carried the same burden she did. "I am sorry about your brother," she said softly. "And I am sorry that you still carry that guilt, even though I'm certain it was not truly your fault." "I left the lantern burning," Owen said, his voice rough. "That makes it my fault." "You made a mistake. You were young, and you could not have known what would happen. Accidents happen, Owen. Terrible, tragic accidents that no amount of guilt or punishment can undo." She was saying the words as much to herself as to him, trying to make herself believe them. They stood in the kitchen as the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, two people bound by shared grief and understanding. Then Owen cleared his throat and picked up his coffee cup again. "I should let you get back to work before the men start appearing for breakfast. But Tessa, if you ever need to talk about the nightmares, or if there is anything I can do to make the nights easier, please tell me." "I will," she promised. "And thank you, Owen, for understanding." Over the following weeks, something shifted between them. They were still employer and employee, still maintained the proper boundaries that society demanded, but there was a connection now, a recognition of kindred spirits. Owen made a point of being in the kitchen when Tessa came down in the mornings, and they would share coffee and quiet conversation before the rest of the household woke. He told her about building the ranch from nothing, about the years of backbreaking work and financial struggle before things finally started to turn around. She told him about growing up on her family's farm, about her father's dreams of prosperity that never quite materialized, about the happy memories that made the loss even more painful. The ranch hands noticed the growing friendship and teased Owen mercilessly when Tessa was not around, but he bore it with good humor. Tommy in particular seemed delighted by the development and made sure that Tessa never ran short of candles, sometimes bringing her extra even when she had not asked. It was in early June, nearly 2 months after Tessa had arrived at the ranch, that Owen found her in the garden behind the house late one evening. She had taken to spending time there after dinner was cleared away, finding peace in the simple act of tending to the vegetables and herbs. The sun had set perhaps half an hour earlier, and the last light was fading from the sky. She had a lantern sitting on the ground beside her, its light illuminating the tomato plants she was staking. "You are out here late," Owen observed, settling onto the ground beside her with less grace than usual. She noticed that he looked tired, his face lined with exhaustion. "I wanted to get these plants secured before the storm tomorrow," Tessa said, tying another length of twine around a particularly heavy branch. "Tommy said we are supposed to get quite a bit of rain, and I did not want them to break under the weight." "Tommy is usually right about the weather. The kid has a sense for it." Owen was quiet for a moment, watching her work. "Tessa, I want to ask you something, and you can say no if you want. There would be no offense taken." She paused in her work, turning to look at him fully. "What is it?" "There is a dance in Fort Smith on Saturday night at the town hall. It is a fundraiser for the new schoolhouse they are building. I was thinking of going, and I wondered if you might like to accompany me." He rushed through the words, as if afraid he might lose his nerve halfway through, and Tessa found the hint of nervousness endearing. "Are you asking me to go as your employee, or as something else?" she asked carefully, needing to understand what he was offering. Owen met her eyes steadily. "I am asking you as a man who has come to care for a woman, and who hopes she might feel something similar. I know that it has only been 2 months, and I know that working relationships are complicated, but I cannot seem to stop thinking about you, Tessa. If that makes you uncomfortable, we can forget I said anything, and things can go back to how they were." Tessa's heart was beating so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. She had been trying not to acknowledge her growing feelings for Owen, telling herself that it was too soon after her loss, that he was her employer, that falling for him would only complicate everything. But the truth was that she had come to care for him deeply, that his presence had become the best part of her days, that she looked forward to their morning conversations with an eagerness that had nothing to do with caffeine. "Things cannot go back to how they were," she said quietly, "because I feel it too, Owen. I have been trying not to, trying to be sensible, but I cannot seem to help it." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise, transforming his usually serious expression into something radiant. "Then you will come to the dance with me?" "Yes," Tessa said, smiling back at him. "I would like that very much." Saturday arrived with perfect weather, the threatened storm having blown through on Friday and left everything washed clean and fresh. Tessa wore her best dress, a deep blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes, and spent longer than usual on her hair, pinning it up in a style that was both elegant and practical. When she came downstairs, she found Owen waiting in the sitting room wearing clean trousers and a white shirt that looked newly pressed, his usually unruly hair neatly combed. "You look beautiful," he said, standing when she entered the room. "You look very handsome yourself," Tessa replied, feeling suddenly shy despite their months of easy conversation. The ride into Fort Smith took about an hour in the buggy Owen had harnessed, and they filled the time with comfortable talk about the ranch and the upcoming cattle drive. But underneath the ordinary conversation, Tessa was acutely aware of his presence beside her, of the occasional brush of his shoulder against hers when the buggy hit a rough patch of road. The dance was already in full swing when they arrived, the town hall filled with people from Fort Smith and the surrounding ranches and farms. A small band played enthusiastically, if not entirely skillfully, in one corner, and tables laden with food and punch-lined one wall. Tessa saw several women from the dress shop and waved to them, noting their raised eyebrows and interested looks when they saw she was with Owen Morgan. "Would you like some punch?" Owen asked, and Tessa nodded, grateful for a moment to collect herself. He returned a few minutes later with 2 cups of what turned out to be surprisingly good fruit punch, and they found a spot along the wall where they could watch the dancing. "I should warn you that I'm not particularly good at dancing," Owen said after they had stood there for a few minutes. "My mother tried to teach me when I was younger, but I never quite got the hang of it. But if you would like to try, I am willing to embarrass myself for your sake." Tessa laughed, some of her nervousness dissipating. "I am not much of a dancer either, to be honest, but we could try one and see how badly we do." They made their way onto the floor as a new song started, and Owen took her hand with a care that made her chest tighten. He had not been lying about his dancing skills, and they stumbled through the first minute or so with a distinct lack of grace. But then Tessa started laughing at their mutual incompetence, and Owen joined in. And suddenly it did not matter that they were probably the worst dancers in the room because they were having fun together. They danced 3 more songs after that, each one slightly less disastrous than the last, and then retreated to the punch table, hot and breathless and grinning. Other people came up to talk to Owen, ranchers and businessmen who knew him by reputation, if not personally, and he introduced Tessa as a friend, not an employee. She appreciated the distinction more than she could say. It was during a break between songs, when they were standing near one of the open windows trying to cool down, that a well-dressed man in his 40s approached them with a tight smile. "Morgan," he said, his tone cordial but not warm. "I heard you were planning to drive your herd to Kansas City this year instead of shipping from Van Buren." "That is right, Mr. Dalton," Owen replied, his body language subtly shifting to something more guarded. "The prices have been better in Kansas City, and I have enough men now to make the drive feasible." Dalton's smile did not reach his eyes. "That is a risky proposition, especially for someone whose operation is not as established as some. A lot can go wrong on a cattle drive. Animals get lost, accidents happen. Would be a shame if you lost your investment." There was something in the way he said it that made the words sound less like concern and more like a veiled threat. Tessa felt Owen tense beside her, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "I appreciate your concern," Owen said evenly, "but I am confident in my men and my planning. We will be fine." After Dalton moved away, Tessa touched Owen's arm gently. "Who was that?" "Calvin Dalton. He runs the largest shipping operation out of Van Buren. When I ship cattle by rail from there, he gets a cut. He is not happy that I'm planning to bypass him this year by driving directly to Kansas City." Owen's jaw was tight. "He has been making noise about it around town, trying to suggest that I'm taking foolish risks or that I do not know what I'm doing." "Is there any real risk?" Tessa asked. "There is always risk in a cattle drive. But I have done my research, hired experienced drovers, and planned the route carefully. Dalton is just upset about losing money." Owen looked down at her, his expression softening. "I am sorry. This is not the kind of conversation I should be having with you at a dance. I want to know about your life, Owen, the good parts and the difficult parts." Tessa squeezed his arm gently. "We are friends, are we not? And perhaps something more than that?" "Perhaps," Owen agreed. His eyes warmed despite the tension that still lingered in his shoulders. "Definitely something more than that, if I have any say in it." They stayed at the dance for another hour, and when they finally headed back to the ranch, the moon was high and bright, turning the landscape silver. Owen drove with one hand and held Tessa's with the other, their fingers intertwined on the seat between them. It felt natural and right, and Tessa found herself thinking about how strange it was that tragedy could lead to something good, that loss could somehow open the door to connection. When they reached the ranch and Owen helped her down from the buggy, he held onto her hands for a moment longer than necessary. "I had a wonderful time tonight," he said softly. "So did I." Tessa looked up at him, at the way the moonlight caught in his hair and shadowed his features, making him look both familiar and mysterious. Owen lifted one hand to cup her cheek gently. "May I kiss you?" Instead of answering, Tessa rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle and sweet, tentative in the way of people who are still learning each other, but it sent warmth flooding through her body. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "I should go in," Tessa said reluctantly. "It is late, and you have an early morning." "We both do," Owen agreed, but he did not let go of her hand until she reached the porch steps. "Sleep well, Tessa." That night, Tessa lit her candle as usual, but she found herself thinking less about nightmares and more about the feel of Owen's lips on hers, the careful way he touched her, as if she was something precious. The dreams still came, but they were less vivid than usual, as if the new memories were building a shield against the old horrors. Over the following weeks, Tessa and Owen's relationship deepened. Though they were careful to maintain propriety around the ranch hands, they would steal moments together when they could. A touch of hands in passing, conversations that stretched late into the evening after everyone else had gone to bed. Owen began coming to her room some nights when the nightmares were particularly bad. Not to do anything improper, but simply to sit in the chair by the window and talk to her until she felt calm enough to sleep again. His presence helped as much as the candlelight, maybe more. And Tessa began to understand that she was falling in love with him in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. It was in mid-July, as preparations for the cattle drive were reaching their peak, that Owen asked Tessa to take a ride with him one evening after dinner. They saddled horses and rode out to a high point on the ranch where you could see for miles in every direction, the land rolling away in waves of grass and scattered trees. The sun was just beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. "This is beautiful," Tessa breathed, taking in the view. "This is why I built the ranch here," Owen said, dismounting and helping her down. "When I first saw this spot, I knew this was where I was meant to be. It felt like home in a way that nowhere else ever had." They sat on the grass, close enough that their shoulders touched, and watched the sunset in companionable silence. Finally, Owen turned to her, his expression serious. "Tessa, I need to tell you something. The cattle drive is going to take about 6 weeks. Maybe longer if we run into problems. I will be leaving in 2 days, and I will not be back until late August at the earliest." The thought of 6 weeks without seeing him sent a pang through Tessa's chest, but she understood that this was his livelihood, his dream. "I know," she said quietly. "Tommy mentioned the timeline. I have arranged for Tommy and 2 of the older hands to stay behind to watch the ranch and the remaining stock. They will be here if you need anything, and Mrs. Patterson has agreed to come stay in the house with you for propriety's sake." Owen took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "I am going to miss you terribly. These past few months with you have been the happiest I can remember in a very long time." "I will miss you too," Tessa said, her throat tight. "Please be careful out there. Owen, I know that Dalton's warnings were just meant to frighten you, but there are real dangers on a cattle drive." "I will be careful, I promise." Owen raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "And when I get back, Tessa, I want to talk to you about the future, about our future, if you think that is something you might want." Tessa's heart was pounding. "I think that is something I might want very much." Owen smiled, that brilliant expression that transformed his whole face, and leaned in to kiss her. The kiss was deeper than their previous ones, filled with promise and longing and the unspoken understanding of 2 people who had found something rare and precious. When they finally pulled apart, the sun had fully set, and the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. The day Owen left was harder than Tessa had anticipated. She woke early to make a substantial breakfast for the men who would be riding out, and she stood on the porch with Patterson, who had arrived the previous evening, and watched as Owen and his crew drove the cattle herd north toward Kansas. Owen had kissed her goodbye before dawn, a lingering embrace in the kitchen with only the candlelight as witness, and had promised to send word when he could. The weeks that followed were long. Tessa kept herself busy with her usual work and with helping Mrs. Patterson with various projects around the house. The older woman turned out to be surprisingly good company, full of stories about the early days of Fort Smith and about the various characters who had passed through over the years. But the nights were difficult. Without Owen's occasional presence to ward off the worst of the nightmares, Tessa found herself struggling more than she had since her first weeks at the ranch. She went through candles at an alarming rate, sometimes lighting 2 or 3 in a night when one would have sufficed before. Tommy noticed and made sure she had plenty without commenting on the increased usage. His young face creased with concern. On the worst nights, when the dreams of fire and death became too much to bear alone, Tessa would get up and sit in the kitchen, lighting lamps until the room blazed like daylight, and would try to distract herself with baking or mending. It was during one of these nights, about 4 weeks after Owen had left, that Mrs. Patterson came downstairs to find Tessa surrounded by light, kneading bread dough with mechanical efficiency. "Another bad one?" the older woman asked gently, wrapping a shawl around her nightgown and settling into a chair at the table. Tessa nodded, not trusting herself to speak without crying. "You miss him," Mrs. Patterson observed. It was not a question. "Yes," Tessa admitted, "but it is more than that. The nightmares are worse when I'm alone. When Owen was here, they seemed less powerful somehow. His presence made me feel safe in a way that even the candlelight cannot quite match." Mrs. Patterson smiled knowingly. "That is love, my dear. When you find the person who makes you feel safe, who helps quiet the demons that haunt you, that is when you know it is real." "I have only known him for 5 months, Tessa said, voicing the doubt that had been nagging at her. "Is it possible to truly love someone in such a short time?" "I knew I loved my Henry within 2 weeks of meeting him," Mrs. Patterson replied. "We were married 3 months later and had 42 happy years together before he passed. Time is not always a reliable measure of love, Tessa. Sometimes you just know." 3 days later, a rider came from Fort Smith with mail, and there was a letter for Tessa in Owen's distinctive handwriting. She took it to her room to read in private, her hands shaking as she broke the seal. The letter was full of details about the drive, about the challenges they were facing and the progress they were making. He told her about a river crossing that had been more difficult than anticipated, about a thunderstorm that had spooked the cattle and required a full night of work to round them all up again, about the endless miles of grassland they were traversing. But woven throughout the practical details were personal notes that made Tessa's heart ache with longing. He wrote about thinking of her constantly, about how he found himself looking forward to returning home more than he looked forward to the financial success of the drive. He wrote about missing their morning conversations and the way she laughed at his terrible jokes. And at the end, he wrote words that made tears spring to her eyes. "I am not a man who speaks easily of his feelings, and I know that this is perhaps not the most romantic way to say this, but I find that I cannot wait any longer. I love you, Tessa Owens. I think I have loved you since that first morning in the kitchen when you told me about your nightmares and I saw my own pain reflected in your eyes. When I return, I want to ask you properly, with all the ceremony such a question deserves. But I wanted you to know now, while we are apart, that you have given me something I thought I had lost forever. You have given me hope. Yours always, Owen." Tessa read the letter 3 times, each time finding new meaning in the words, and then carefully folded it and placed it under her pillow. That night, she lit her candle as usual, but she also reread Owen's letter by its light before going to sleep, and the nightmares were gentler than they had been in weeks. 2 weeks later, on a hot August afternoon, Tessa was in the garden picking beans when Tommy came running from the direction of the northern pastures, his face split in a huge grin. "They are back!" he shouted. "I saw the dust from the herd about 3 miles out. They'll be here within the hour." Tessa dropped the basket of beans and ran for the house, suddenly conscious of her dusty dress and windblown hair. Mrs. Patterson laughed at her panic and helped her change into a clean dress and tidy her appearance, though the older woman's eyes were knowing and kind. By the time Tessa made it back outside, she could see the approaching herd and the riders who moved alongside it, directing it toward the holding pens near the ranch. She spotted Owen immediately riding at the front on his big bay gelding, and even from a distance she could see the moment he saw her standing on the porch. He said something to the rider beside him and then broke away from the herd, urging his horse into a gallop that ate up the distance between them. Owen dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, and Tessa met him halfway between the porch and where he had been, propriety forgotten, as she threw herself into his arms. He caught her and lifted her off her feet, burying his face in her hair. And Tessa felt something in her chest that had been tight and painful for 6 weeks finally relax. "I missed you," Owen said roughly, his voice muffled against her hair. "God, Tessa, I missed you so much." "I missed you too," Tessa said, pulling back just enough to look at his face. He was thinner than when he had left, his skin deeply tanned and lined with exhaustion, but his eyes were bright with joy and relief. "You look terrible." Owen laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. 6 weeks on a cattle drive will do that to a man, but we made it. No major losses, no serious injuries, and the cattle sold for even better than I had hoped. The Double M is secure for years to come. "I am so proud of you," Tessa said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. "I got your letter," Owen said. "The one you sent to the post office in Baxter Springs. Thank you for that." "I got yours too. The one where you said you loved me." Tessa felt suddenly shy, aware that they had an audience of ranch hands who were pretending not to watch while absolutely watching. "I meant every word of that letter," Owen said seriously. "And I have been thinking about what I wanted to say when I got back, planning it out during those long days on the trail." He took both of her hands in his, and Tessa realized with a start that he was shaking slightly. "Tessa Owens, I know that we have only known each other for 5 months, and I know that there is much about my life that is uncertain and difficult, but you have become the center of my world, the person I think about first when I wake, and last before I sleep. I love you more than I thought it possible to love anyone, and I want to spend the rest of my life making you as happy as you have made me. Will you marry me?" Tessa was crying, tears streaming down her face, even as she smiled widely enough that her cheeks hurt. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking on the word. "Yes, Owen, I will marry you." The cheer that went up from the watching ranch hands was deafening, and Owen pulled Tessa close and kissed her with an enthusiasm that would probably have scandalized Mrs. Patterson if the older woman had not been cheering right along with everyone else. When they finally broke apart, both laughing and crying at the same time, Tessa felt as if her heart might burst with happiness. The next weeks passed in a blur of planning. They decided to marry in late September, giving Owen time to fully settle the financial matters from the cattle drive and giving Tessa time to prepare. Mrs. Patterson took charge of the wedding arrangements with the efficiency of a military general, coordinating with the minister at Fort Smith's Methodist Church and organizing a reception that would be held at the ranch itself. Tessa wrote to her aunt in Little Rock, the only family she had left, and received a reply that was both congratulatory and relieved that Tessa had found someone to care for her. She purchased fabric for a wedding dress and spent her evenings sewing it by candlelight, creating something simple but beautiful in cream-colored silk. Owen went to Fort Smith and returned with a ring, a simple gold band with a small diamond that had belonged to his grandmother. Throughout the preparations, Owen made good on his promise from Tessa's first day at the ranch. Every evening, before he retired to his own room, he would light the candle in Tessa's room, making sure it was secure and safe. It became a ritual between them, a small act of care that spoke volumes about his understanding of her needs and his willingness to help bear her burdens. The nightmares had not stopped entirely, but they had lessened in frequency and intensity. Tessa still woke sometimes in the middle of the night, heart racing and skin clammy with remembered fear, but now she had Owen just down the hall, and on the very worst nights he would come and sit with her, holding her hand and talking quietly until the terror faded. The wedding day arrived with perfect autumn weather, the oppressive heat of summer finally breaking into comfortable warmth. Tessa dressed in her cream silk gown with help from Mrs. Patterson and her aunt, who had arrived 2 days earlier. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman who looked back, seeing someone who appeared happy and hopeful rather than haunted and exhausted. The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful, held in the small church with what seemed like half of Fort Smith in attendance. Tommy served as one of Owen's groomsmen, grinning so widely that Tessa worried his face might split. When Owen saw her walking down the aisle on her aunt's arm, the look on his face made every difficult moment of the past year worthwhile. They exchanged vows in front of the minister and their assembled friends, promising to love and cherish each other through all the challenges that life might bring. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Owen kissed Tessa with a gentleness that made her eyes sting with tears, and she knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. The reception at the ranch was loud and joyful, with more food than seemed possible, and music provided by several of the ranch hands who turned out to have surprising musical talent. Tessa danced with Owen, and this time neither of them cared that they were not particularly graceful because they were together and happy. She danced with Tommy and with several of the other ranch hands and with her aunt, who cried through the entire waltz. As the evening wore on and the guests began to depart, Owen pulled Tessa aside, away from the crowd and toward the house. "I have something to show you," he said, his eyes bright with a secret. He led her upstairs to what had been her room but was now to be their room, as they had decided to convert it into the master bedroom since it was larger and had a better view. When Owen opened the door, Tessa gasped. The room had been transformed. The furniture had been rearranged to accommodate a larger bed, and new curtains hung at the windows. But what caught Tessa's attention most was the series of metal sconces that had been mounted on the walls, each one holding a candle. There were 6 of them positioned around the room, and all of them were lit, filling the space with warm, dancing light. "I know that you need light to sleep," Owen said quietly, watching her face. "And I wanted to make sure that you would always have it, that you would never have to worry about running out of candles or about one not being enough. I had these installed while we were making the other changes, and I will keep them lit every night for as long as you need them." Tessa turned to him, tears streaming down her face for what felt like the 100th time that day. "You did this for me?" "I would do anything for you," Owen said simply. "I love you, Tessa, and I want you to feel safe here in our home for the rest of our lives." She kissed him then, pouring all her love and gratitude and joy into the embrace. When they finally pulled apart, Owen swept her up into his arms and carried her to the bed, and the candles burned bright throughout the night, bearing witness to the beginning of their life together. The months that followed were among the happiest of Tessa's life. She and Owen settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both, finding rhythms and routines that worked for them. Owen continued to light the candles every evening, and gradually Tessa found that she did not need quite as many. Some nights 2 or 3 candles were sufficient, and on the best nights when Owen held her close and she felt completely secure, she found that one carefully placed candle was enough to keep the nightmares at bay. They talked often about the losses that had brought them together, about Daniel, and about Tessa's family, keeping the memories alive while also building new ones. Owen took her to visit Daniel's grave one cold December day, and Tessa placed flowers and told the brother she had never met about how his memory had helped save her. In turn, Owen rode with her to Little Rock in the spring, and they stood together at the site where her family's farmhouse had once stood, now just an empty plot being reclaimed by grass and wildflowers. Tessa cried, but this time the tears felt more like release than raw grief, as if she was finally beginning to make peace with what had happened. In May of 1877, Tessa discovered she was pregnant. She told Owen one evening after dinner, and he reacted with such pure joy that it made her laugh and cry at the same time. He became almost comically protective, trying to prevent her from doing any heavy work and worrying constantly about her health. Tommy and the other ranch hands found his hovering endlessly amusing, but Tessa found it sweet, if occasionally excessive. Their son was born in January of 1878, arriving on a bitterly cold night when the wind howled outside and snow fell thick and fast. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Tessa was frightened, but Owen stayed with her throughout, holding her hand and encouraging her. And when the baby finally arrived with a lusty cry, Tessa saw tears streaming down her husband's face. They named him Daniel Thomas Morgan, carrying forward the memory of Owen's brother while giving the baby his own identity. Little Daniel had Owen's dark hair and Tessa's blue eyes, and from the beginning he seemed to have inherited his father's serious disposition, studying the world around him with grave intensity. Having a baby in the house changed everything. The candles had to be more carefully positioned now, well out of reach of curious little hands, and Tessa found herself too exhausted most nights to worry much about nightmares. When Daniel cried in the night, which he did frequently in those early months, both she and Owen would stumble out of bed to tend to him, and somehow the shared exhaustion and the focus on caring for this tiny new person left less room for old fears. By the time Daniel was 6 months old, Tessa realized one morning that she had not needed the candles the previous night. She had fallen asleep before Owen came up to light them, exhausted after a long day of tending to a teething baby, and she had slept through until dawn without a single nightmare. The realization filled her with a complex mix of emotions, relief certainly, but also a strange sort of nostalgia for the ritual that had been such a constant in her life. "I do not think I need them every night anymore," she told Owen that evening, as they sat together in the sitting room. Daniel asleep in a bassinet nearby. The candles, I mean. I'm still afraid of the dark sometimes, but it is not the same as it was. Owen looked up from the ledger he had been working on, his expression thoughtful. "That is wonderful, Tessa. But you know that I will keep lighting them for as long as you want them, right? If you need them once a week, or once a month, or if the nightmares come back, I will be here." "I know," Tessa said, reaching over to take his hand, "and that is part of why I do not need them as much anymore. Because I have you and I know that you will always keep me safe." Still, they kept candles in the room, and there were nights when Tessa asked Owen to light one or two when the memories pressed close or when storms rattled the windows and reminded her too much of that terrible night. But increasingly she found that she could sleep without them, that the warmth of Owen beside her and the sounds of their son breathing peacefully nearby were enough to keep the darkness at bay. The years passed with the kind of gentle contentment that Tessa had never imagined possible. The Double M Ranch continued to thrive, and Owen's reputation as a fair and skilled rancher grew. They had a second child in 1880, a daughter they named Sarah Grace, who had Tessa's blonde hair and Owen's gray-green eyes and a personality as sunny as her brother's was serious. Tommy grew up and eventually married a girl from town, and he and his wife built a small house on the ranch property, with Tommy taking on more and more responsibility for the day-to-day operations. The other ranch hands came and went over the years, but a core group remained, loyal to Owen and to the life they had built together. Tessa never forgot her family or the fire that had taken them, but the memories became less painful over time, softened by the good life she had built with Owen. Sometimes she would tell Daniel and Sarah about their grandparents and uncle they had never met, keeping their memory alive for a new generation. And sometimes on the anniversary of the fire, she would light a candle and sit with it for a while, remembering and mourning and being grateful for the second chance she had been given. Owen, too, carried Daniel's memory with him always, but the guilt that had once consumed him gradually eased. Watching his son grow and thrive, seeing the joy that children brought into their lives, helped him understand that tragedy and happiness were not mutually exclusive, that it was possible to honor the dead while also fully embracing life. On their 10th wedding anniversary in September of 1887, Owen surprised Tessa by taking her back to the high point on the ranch where he had proposed, the same spot where they had watched the sunset the day before he left for his first cattle drive to Kansas City. They left the children with Tommy and his wife for the afternoon and rode out together, savoring the rare moment of solitude. "Do you remember what I said here 10 years ago?" Owen asked as they sat on the grass watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. "You said this felt like home," Tessa replied, leaning against his shoulder, "and you told me you wanted to talk about our future." "I did, and I have to say the reality of that future has exceeded every dream I had." Owen wrapped his arm around her, pulling her closer. "You gave me back my life, Tessa. Before you came, I was just going through the motions, building this ranch because I did not know what else to do. But you reminded me what it meant to truly live, to hope, to love." "You did the same for me," Tessa said softly. "I was drowning in grief and fear, and you threw me a lifeline. You understood my nightmares because you had your own, and you never made me feel weak or broken for needing the light." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun painted the sky in brilliant colors, and Tessa thought about all the nights Owen had faithfully lit candles for her, about the patience and understanding he had shown. She thought about how love was not always grand gestures, but often quiet, consistent acts of care. It was lighting a candle when someone was afraid of the dark. It was staying up through sleepless nights with a crying baby. It was building a life together one day at a time, choosing each other over and over again. "I do not need the candles much anymore," Tessa said after a while. "Maybe once or twice a month now. But I want you to know that even though I do not need them, I will always treasure what they represented. They were proof that you saw my pain and did not turn away from it, that you were willing to do whatever it took to help me heal." "I would do it all again in a heartbeat," Owen said, kissing the top of her head. "Every candle lit, every nightmare weathered, every difficult moment. Because all of it led us here, to this life we have built together." They rode back to the ranch as dusk settled over the landscape, returning to the home they had made and the family they had created. Daniel met them at the door, serious and careful as always at 9 years old, reporting that Sarah had been good but had refused to eat her vegetables. Sarah herself appeared moments later, all energy and mischief at 7, demanding that her parents admire a picture she had drawn. That night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Owen lit a single candle in their bedroom, as he still did whenever Tessa asked or when he sensed she might need it. But this time it felt less like a necessity and more like a tradition, a loving gesture between two people who understood each other's scars and chose to be gentle with them. Years continued to pass, bringing both challenges and triumphs. There was a drought in 1889 that tested the ranch's resources and a bitter winter in 1891 that claimed several head of cattle. Daniel grew into a capable young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did, while Sarah proved to have her mother's skill with a needle and thread, along with a shrewd head for business that surprised everyone. In 1893, Tessa gave birth to twins, 2 boys they named Robert and William, and the house was once again filled with the sounds of children. The twins were polar opposites, Robert quiet and bookish, while William was adventurous and constantly getting into trouble, but they were inseparable from birth. Through it all, Owen and Tessa's love deepened and matured. They weathered difficulties together, supported each other's dreams, and built something lasting and real. The candles were rarely needed now, relegated to occasional nights when old memories surfaced, or when illness or worry made sleep difficult. But they were always there, ready to be lit, a symbol of the care and understanding that had defined their relationship from the beginning. On a warm evening in May of 1896, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, their children and grandchildren, Daniel had married 2 years earlier and had given them a grandson, scattered across the ranch property, Tessa turned to Owen and smiled. "Do you know what I realized today?" "What is that?" Owen asked. His hair now shot through with gray, but his eyes still as bright as they had been when they first met. "I realized that I cannot remember the last time I had a nightmare about the fire. I still remember what happened, of course, and I still grieve for my family. But the nightmares have stopped. They have been gone for so long now that I did not even notice when they finally ended." Owen took her hand, his grip strong and warm and familiar. "That is wonderful, Tessa. You have worked so hard to heal, and you deserve that peace." "I could not have done it without you," Tessa said. Without your understanding, your patience, your willingness to light candles in the dark, even when you must have been exhausted or frustrated or wondering if it would ever get better. I was never frustrated, Owen said quietly. How could I be when I knew exactly what you were going through? We saved each other, Tessa. Your nightmares might have been about your family and mine were about Daniel, but we both understood what it meant to be haunted. And we both understood what it meant to need someone else to help us find our way back to the light. They sat together as the last rays of sunlight faded, and the stars began to appear, holding hands as they had done for nearly 2 decades. Inside the house, candles were being lit by their children as evening activities began, and Tessa smiled at the sight. Candles no longer meant fear and darkness for her. Now they meant home, family, the life she and Owen had built together from the ashes of their separate tragedies. The next morning, Tessa woke early and found Owen already up, standing at the window and looking out over the ranch he had built. She moved to stand beside him, and he wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About how lucky I am," Owen replied. "About how a chance request from Mrs. Patterson brought you into my life and changed everything. About how the worst things that ever happened to us somehow led to the best things." "That is the mystery of life, I suppose," Tessa said. "How tragedy and joy are so often intertwined, how we can carry grief and happiness in the same heart." They stood together watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, and Tessa thought about the girl she had been 20 years ago, terrified of the dark and haunted by loss. She thought about the cowboy who had offered her a job in a safe place to heal, who had lit candles night after night without complaint, who had seen her pain and matched it with his own. She thought about how 2 broken people had found each other, and in finding each other, had become whole. Later that day, Owen surprised her by bringing home a beautiful oil lamp from Fort Smith, one with an etched glass shade that threw patterns of light across the ceiling. "I know you do not need it," he said as he showed her how it worked, "but I saw it and thought of you, thought of all those nights and all those candles, and I wanted to get you something beautiful to remember them by." Tessa ran her fingers over the smooth glass, watching the light refract through the etched patterns. "It is perfect," she said, rising on her toes to kiss him. "Thank you, Owen, for this, and for everything you have given me, for being the light that guided me out of the darkness." They placed the lamp on the dresser in their bedroom, and even though Tessa rarely needed it, Owen would occasionally light it in the evening when they retired to their room, filling the space with gentle, patterned light. It became another part of their routine, another small act of love that required no words. In 1898, when Daniel took over most of the day-to-day operations of the ranch, Owen and Tessa found themselves with more time to simply enjoy each other's company. They would take long rides across the property or sit on the porch for hours talking and watching their grandchildren play. Sarah had opened a dress shop in Fort Smith and was doing well, while the twins were both attending university back east, studying agriculture and business with plans to return and help modernize the ranch. The years had been kind to both of them, though age was beginning to show in small ways. Owen's hair had gone completely gray, and he moved a bit more carefully than he once had. Tessa's hands sometimes ached from decades of sewing, and reading required spectacles now. But they were healthy and content, surrounded by family and by the evidence of a life well lived. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1907, their children threw them a party at the ranch, inviting everyone from Fort Smith and the surrounding area. The house and yard were packed with people, music filled the air, and tables groaned under the weight of food. Tessa wore a new dress that Sarah had made specially for the occasion, and Owen wore his best suit, and they danced together in the yard as the sun set, still as graceless as they had been at that first dance 30 years before, but infinitely happier. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Daniel stood up to make a toast. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who taught us that love is not just about the easy times, but about being there for each other when things are hard. Who showed us that healing is possible, that happiness can be found even after terrible loss, and that the smallest gestures, repeated with love and consistency, can change a life. To Owen and Tessa Morgan. The crowd echoed the toast, and Tessa felt tears on her cheeks as Owen squeezed her hand. Later, after everyone had left and they were preparing for bed, Owen lit the beautiful lamp he had given her years before, even though they had not used it in months. "Why tonight?" Tessa asked, though she was smiling. "Because tonight I want to remember," Owen said simply. "I want to remember that frightened young woman who came to my ranch looking for work, and the scared young man I was who recognized his own pain in her eyes. I want to remember every candle I lit, every nightmare I helped you through, every moment that brought us to where we are now." Tessa moved into his arms, resting her head against his chest and listening to the steady beat of his heart. "We have built something beautiful," she said softly. "Out of our grief and our fear, we built love and family and a home that will last for generations." "We did," Owen agreed. "And I would not change a single moment of it, even the difficult ones, because all of it was necessary to bring us here." They stood together in the lamplight, two people who had found each other in darkness and had chosen to walk toward the light together. The fears that had once defined them were now just memories, painful but no longer crippling. The nightmares that had seemed insurmountable had been overcome through patience, love, and the simple act of keeping a light burning. As they finally settled into bed that night, the lamp still glowing softly on the dresser, Tessa thought about how much had changed since that first terrified night at the ranch when she had lit her first candle. She had learned that healing was not a destination but a journey, that love could be found in unexpected places, and that sometimes the greatest act of courage was simply allowing yourself to be cared for by another person. "I love you," she whispered to Owen as sleep began to claim her. "I love you too," he murmured back. "Always have, always will." The lamp burned through the night, its patterned light dancing across the ceiling, a testament to 2 decades of care and devotion. And in the morning, when sunlight streamed through the windows and filled the room with natural light, Tessa woke feeling grateful and at peace, surrounded by the life she and Owen had built together, one candle, one kindness, one day at a time. Their story became legend in Fort Smith, the tale of the cowboy who kept a candle lit all night for the woman who could not sleep without a light burning bright, and of how that simple act of understanding had blossomed into a love that lasted a lifetime. It was told at weddings and anniversary celebrations, held up as an example of what true partnership looked like. And whenever someone in town struggled with their own demons, with fears that seemed overwhelming, they would remember Owen and Tessa Morgan, and they would know that healing was possible, that love could conquer even the darkest of fears, and that sometimes all it took was someone willing to keep a light burning through the longest of nights.